Welcome back to Final Trade. I wanted to talk today about playing cards that have large effects on the game and making sure that you play good cards that have large effects and not bad cards that have large effects. Or if you do play the bad ones, make sure you're controlling the situation so that the overall outcome is good. So, here's the first thing. Jokel Hops, okay. Bury all artifacts, creatures, and lands. This is a classic destruction card, and it's very powerful. If you build a deck that's based around using this, then you can gain a lot of control from it. You clear your opponent's permanents out of the way at a time when you're ready to exploit that situation. Similarly, balance. It comes in and it wrecks land and creatures and cards in each player's hand. Ironic, one of the most unbalanced cards in the history of the game is called Balance, but very, very, very powerful card. And, everyone would say, yes, Balance is a great card. It's a great card to play. But it's a great card to play in a balance deck, Rack Balance or something else. So you need to be prepared to play it. The same with Nevinyrral's Disc. This was a staple of Necropotence, of Red Burn decks, things like that, because of its power to get rid of creatures and artifacts mainly. Enchantments to a lesser extent. So, all three of these cards so far, they have very large effects on the game. They're going to clear out all creatures and or all enchantments and or hands or whatever. And then you just have kind of the single sniping ones. Let's take out all enchantments or just all artifacts or just all creatures or, of course, just all land. And so everybody understands these are good cards. And what goes unstated there is that these are good cards because they're played correctly. Obviously, if you play a white weenie deck, you probably don't want a Wrath of God in that deck. It's just not a smart card to have in the deck. And so, there's some other class of cards that are kind of a massive effect on the game, but they're persistent. And so you have Humility. This was a great broken card, so powerful. But it's an enchantment, so it stays in play. Stasis, of course, if you have ever played against a Turbo Stasis deck, whether it uses Chronotog or Felden's Cane or however it manages its own library while it slowly decks you, then you understand the power of this card. Very powerful. Winter Orb, of course, very good in decks with shallow mana curves and in decks where you have alternate sources of mana like artifacts or creatures. And again, no one would say these cards are bad, and Mana Barbs also works as well as works in decks the same as Winter Orb would, except sadly it's not a colorless artifact. But again, you would never play Stasis in just a random deck because it would mess up your play as well as your opponent's. So you need to have it in the correct deck. But here's the problem. These are good most of the time. But there's a class of these that are bad most of the time, but a lot of players don't realize it. They see them and they think, hey, that's a really cool effect. I want that, but they don't understand the downsides to it. So the first one would be Well of Knowledge. Okay, so anytime during your draw phase, you just pay an extra 2 mana and you draw another card as many times as you want. The problem with this kind of thing is that you're going to put this into play during your turn because it's a permanent. Well, that means that the first person who gets a draw phase after this comes into play is your opponent. So your opponent benefits from it before you do, and your opponent gets to benefit from it. The point of the game is to win. It's to do things that harass and harry your opponent so that you gain incremental advantages until you accumulate enough advantages that you win the game. And this card is really bad at that, especially since it gives the ability to draw. That's something you don't want to give your opponent the ability to draw, except in situations like playing Turbo Stasis, where their mana is locked down, their creatures can't attack, and you're just making them draw until they deck themselves. So, this is a card that's popular in casual gaming, but And a naive player might think, oh, that's a cool card. I can just, pay mana to draw extra cards. But it's really bad because it gives your opponent the same advantage. And if your opponent's playing a deck style where maybe he hasn't included enough of ways to augment his card drawing, then this will help him, and it may help him more than it helps you. What's the next one? Howling Mine, same story. Everybody gets an extra card every turn, but again, your opponent gets to use it before you do. And I remember this is one I would see played a lot when I was in high school. And, we were all young, dumb kids playing in the library. Very few of us even understood that game theory was a study, much less any of the lessons of it. And so, kids would play this card because it was a crowd pleaser. Hey, everybody gets to draw an additional card, and we're all playing ridiculous bad decks anyway that, function on some convoluted 6-card combo or something like that. And so this was popular, but it was terrible. And again, with the exception of something like stasis decks, there's almost no time when you want to play this. But in a stasis deck, it allows you to deck your opponent faster. It forces them to draw cards. So, but in general, this is a bad card to play, even though it's popular and it's fun. Eladamri's Vineyard, yeah, I'm guilty of playing this one in high school. I played a green mana pump, kind of senior stompy style deck, and I thought this was good. It's not worth losing a slot in the deck for it. And again, your opponents get the mana too. It doesn't really matter that the mana is green. That really doesn't make up for the fact that your opponents are going to get it and they can benefit from it every turn just like you can. So it's a very dangerous card, and like the rest, the effect triggers at the beginning of your main phase, and so you can't play this except during your main phase, so your opponent gets the bonus first. Prosperity. You would never want to play this outside of a combo that is going to win you the game this turn, like Prosbloom. Now, Prosbloom plays it incredibly effectively. You essentially play a couple copies of this on one turn, draw your entire library, turn the cards into mana, turn your land into mana, and then you use a life drain to kill your opponent. But you would never want to play this otherwise because, again, as a sorcery, you're going to be probably tapping as much mana as you can to get as big of an effect as possible, and then you won't have any mana to take advantage of all those new cards in your hand this turn. Your opponent will get a whole bunch of cards in their hand during your turn, and then during their turn, they get a fresh mana pool to play them. So it's another one of those kind of bad cards where it looks fun, it looks powerful, but you have to use it in really select situations to get the benefit from it. So be very careful with these kind of things. Of course, Mana Flare. That's another one like Howling Mine that you used to see a lot playing as a kid. Very popular card. Everybody suddenly has double the mana, but your opponents have double the mana probably before you. Now, this one's not always before you, but you've at least got to spend 3 mana, probably tapping 3 lands in order to get this out, so that you can then double whatever you have left. So your opponent will probably have an advantage over you, but it's not as pure of an advantage as, say, these 3. Again, you can come up with convoluted situations where this is a good card. It's difficult. The same with this. Furnace of Wrath. This is the last one I wanted to show. Doubles all damage. I remember, back when the Tempest block was the new thing, there was a pre-constructed red deck, and it had a copy of this in every one of them. And so enough kids bought the pre-constructed deck that there were tons of copies of this floating around, and very rarely you would even get 2 of them played during a game if you had a 4, 5, 6 person game going on in the library in the morning. But man, this is a bad card. You've got to sink 4 mana to get this thing out. Then you've got to hope that whatever you've got left in your hand during the turn does enough damage that you can make it up and win. And so there's very limited use cases for these, where all of these, the number of use cases are much greater. And so you have to start thinking in a way that lets you figure out when are these good and when are these bad? And of course, you can take stuff like Mana Flare and Furnace of Wrath, and you can make them really good. There you go. That's all it takes. Put it out, attack with your creatures, whatever you're doing, then play your Final Fortune, and then you get to use the effect first. And essentially on all of these you would. But I point out Mana Flare and Furnace of Wrath because they're red and Final Fortune is red. But so there are ways to kind of turn this around and make it more useful. But in general, think about who is going to benefit from this card, me or my opponent. Is it possible that my opponent benefits? Most of the time when you play a Nevinyrral's Disc, your opponent will not benefit. And, you're very rarely going to have a Nevinyrral's Disc in a deck where you are heavily reliant on creatures, but you're also unable to replace ones you may lose. And so it may be a slightly situational card for you, as opposed to Balance, where it's the mainstay of the deck. It's the mainstay of destroying your opponent's hand and their lands and their creatures so that you can slowly kill them with the rack. But think about that before you put things like this in your deck. Who is going to benefit? Is it possible that my opponent benefits? Who benefits first? Who's going to benefit long term from this? How might it help my opponent based on deficiencies in his deck or his play style? And be sure that you're not accidentally helping your opponent. And always remember, you need to think about this not as, do I win or lose this game? You need to think about it as, what is my win percentage? And how does this affect my long-term win-loss ratio? Think of it like that. And think, if I play a Howling Mine in a deck, if I have a deck already built that I like, that plays pretty well, and then I just drop 4 Howling Mines in there, will it improve or decrease my win percentage over time? So think about things like that and ask yourself those questions so that you can figure out, is this card bad? Is it hurting me? And is it good? And is it effective? All right, guys. Thanks a lot.